Right, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to the latest Welund seminar. Delighted to have so many of you along. And it's a bit of a first for us in that we are actually live streaming at the moment. So you will have seen all the various emails going out. It's taken us a bit of going to get it up and running, but we're going out. We've currently got 32 people watching on live stream as well. So a technical revolution for us. We're going to be taking questions from people on the live stream and during the course presentations, but I'll ask if you could just, during the individual speakers' presentations, hang off. We will have a moment at the end, and then hopefully we'll finish in enough time to have some open discussion and any further questions at the end as well. Just as a precursor to that, we do operate these sessions under the Chatham House rules, so by all means feel free to discuss the content, but you'll see by the names in the room that we'd all rather those not be shared outside of these rooms, just so we can be completely open and candid with each other. It's been a fantastic year for Welund. A lot has changed, and you will have noticed by the various changes on the websites and whatever else that we've really been trying to keep as fresh and as up to date as possible. A lot of those suggestions have actually come from these sorts of meetings. So we've got various Welund team in the room. If I could just spin round in turn, Paul, can you wave at everybody? Paul's going to be presenting to us on emerging strategies. We've then got Adam, who's joined us relatively recently. He's going to be talking to us about social media. Peter, wave to everybody. Peter's one of our research team. We've then got Ellie and Steve from EOS. Now, EOS are the superpower behind our travel alerts. Steve's actually going to be giving us a brief presentation shortly to tell us a bit more about that. Nick, over at the back there, again, one of our research team, who many of you will be familiar with from the proactive alerts that you'll be receiving. Alan, another partner with us here. Alan's going to be talking to us about responding to AGM protests. And then we've got Jean at the back, who's the mastermind behind organising these seminars and making sure that everybody's in the right place at the right time. So, without further ado, Steve, can I hand over to you, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Stephen Harwood. I head up the Special Risks Division for EOS Risk. We do provide all the travel alerts that you may log into on the side of the Welund platform, and that's my colleague at the back, Ellie, provides all those. So a little bit about EOS and what we do. We're a professional security and crisis services business that is an enabler to help individuals, companies or governments be able to operate in complex environments or challenging situations around the world. We've been, our inception was in 2004. We've grown exponentially since then. We do half of our business is marine and another half is land. We have 300 plus personnel anywhere in the world, pretty much any time. We try and keep that as a baseline that allows us to be able to operate and give people's businesses that ability to be able to work within that tolerance. So sometimes it can be quite a challenge if we lose a contract or a contract dips, and then we have to try and offset those to somewhere else. So of course, as a business, we're constantly looking to be able to sustain that. We run a 24/7 operations room, which is an actual 24/7 operations room. There's 5 staff in there. It's manned 365 days a year, and you do get an actual warm body at the end of the telephone should there be an incident or a crisis or a response to take into consideration. So our verticals are research, so our advisory is response. We're heavily involved with the insurance sector, so we do a lot of different things with those. One of the areas I manage is within the kidnap and ransom sector. We're currently on $5.5 million worth of premium. I hope to be on about 10 by the end of the year, and that's all kidnap and ransom related products. Our protective services division then handles the land and the marine side, so that can be anything from coast protection to an offshore asset somewhere in the Gulf of Guinea. Assistance, pathfinding, you want to go into a foreign country, you've never been there before, we may have been there, we may be able to give you assistance and risk mitigation on what some of the things you might be having to find. Equally, we may have the opportunity to be able to assist you in that with an operation that we currently got going on. So I have an engineering company who wants to go to Saudi Arabia. We currently have a large operation in Jazan. It's very simple. I've already got assets there. I can move things around accordingly to help. And obviously the marine, which I've touched. So on the advisory then, bespoke intelligence, and it is bespoke. If you're a client and you come to us, you want something, we will build it for you. We will not necessarily take it off the shelf. Of course, there's going to be some elements of templates that we will use, but on the whole, it is for you as a client, rather than some of the other companies that I'm aware of that have a 3 or 4 tier system, and you buy into that, and that is as it is. The risk assessments are as they are. You know, you have historic. We had a client that was a wealth management company, wanted to buy a large wind farm operation in Mexico, and they wanted some due diligence and risk assessments done on that prior to them even considering doing that, which was something else that we were able to do. Travel risk briefings that if you've looked on the Welund site and you clicked on the log, you will be familiar with, and those are consistent with what's going on in the world today. You know, if we find it, it goes on there, and it also goes onto our site, so it's a dual thing and it's consistent with what is happening on the world today. Cyber capabilities, we have a cyber division, which again is doing emerging risks and looking at what's going on. And everybody's doing some sort of cyber at the moment, and within that, our cyber portfolio, we can do deep dives, look at, again, specific threats to an individual, or indeed plug gaps when things are going slightly awry. So the protective services then, again, you know, there's a lot of journey management we do. So we've got a large company that, Asia, for example, they are moving into Asia in a very large way, and their CEO is moving around constantly. He needs journey management and coast protection wherever he goes. So we have 160 countries covered around the world that we have a partner in those countries, which has been due diligence and tested by one of us to make sure that they can actually do what they say they can do. So if they're going to provide us with a coast protection team or a driver, that driver is as it should be, as is the vehicle should be. Coast protection is as it is, guarding, training and travel risk. So on the man guarding side of things, we have a very small man guarding division, but again, it's like anything, it's capacity driven. If somebody wants something bad enough, we'll go out and find it. With the travel risk, with regard to that, obviously we're pushing out the travel risk alerts, but equally, some people may come to us and say, well, we've got a situation where we've got 50 travellers travelling somewhere and we need monitoring on that, and we can do that also. So that brings me nicely onto our app. So we have an app which is exactly what it says on the tin. It provides travel risk solutions for travellers. So at the moment we've got 9,000 travellers from one company that have that, and they also have 2 other bolt-ons which we provide with that. One of those is your e-ticketing, so you can actually see where the flights are. So if your flight is delayed or has been stopped for some reason, then it'll help you be able to move to get another flight. The other thing that it does as well is we've got a bolt onto that where we can track you if that's something that you require. Now that's a sensitive subject because a lot of people start getting a little bit worried when the tracking is mentioned. When the Manchester incident happened, when the Manchester bomb went off in the arena, we were tracking an engineering company that had 55,000 staff worldwide. 1,000 of those worked in Manchester. They couldn't find 3 of those. We had the ability to be able to find the 3 people that they couldn't find. I can't really go into where 2 of them were, but I'll leave that to your imagination. Again, it's very, very cost effective. The more people that are on it, the cheaper it is. So that brings me on to our insurance side, which I am heavily involved in with us. So we're written into 2 policies, so Nove and CFC underwriting, and all of their marine business is currently what we look after in relation to crisis response. So each one of those companies will have a dedicated line to our operations centre. We do constant CMT training. I incident manage the whole thing from cradle to grave, absolutely everything. So from negotiation strategy with the responder to going into the CMT, doing crisis management training, giving the insured the ability to be able to react and understand what the process of a kidnap and ransom situation is and the scenario that would or could take place. On top of that, then you've got for example, if it's in the Gulf of Guinea, I will fly to Nigeria, I will get in there, I will conduct and assist with the ransom drop, then do all the evacuation and the repatriation, and then get the hostages back to their home country. So it's a whole situation that's completely and utterly in one box, and we call it response in a box because we don't have to go out and look for any of the areas that people might look for. For example, we've got an office in Lagos. So immediately, should we need to do anything, we're already onto our guys in Lagos to be able to move and get our people to where they need to be, which is normally Port Harcourt. again, what we do with just at the bottom here, sorry, the disaster management and response side, we've just done a search and rescue mission in Puerto Rico. And again, this is, you can only prove somebody in times of crisis. And there was a company that said that they could do what they said they could do, which they couldn't do. This particular company came to us and we were able to find 16 people that couldn't be found in Puerto Rico. I had teams on the ground at the time, and it helped being able to do that, which again was quite challenging because there was very little communication. Dropping down to the cyber crisis management within a K&R case, it's extremely important that you limit the exposure that the company has and also the insured has, so we have the ability to monitor outwardly to see what's coming in, what people are saying about the case at the time, to see whether it can cause a problem. And it can cause a problem when you've got people in certain countries who are rerunning for election and they're posting stuff that they're assisting to help get people saved when they have actually no even understanding of what's going on the case. So moving on then to our maritime side, we protect vessels all over the world from, I like to say from the peddler right the way up to the jack-up rig, but we do a lot of various things in between. And again, we've got a very, very mature understanding of the market, what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, which is also very, very important in today's ever-changing tolerance for risk, shall we say. So currently then, all the red is where we've got operations going on at the moment. That's not to say that I can't do stuff in the grey or EOS can't do stuff in the grey, but all the red is where we are currently operating in one shape or form, whether that be protective services, risk assessments, crisis response or something along those lines. I wanted to keep it short because obviously there's a lot of other people, but if anybody has any specific questions or anything that they want to discuss with me personally, I mean, I've got my contact details and I'm more than happy to give them out to anybody who wants them, or equally Lawrence can spread the word.
Excellent, Steve. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yep, Steve will be hanging around afterwards, so do feel free to grab and ask any questions later on. Paul, can I invite you up, please?
Thank you. Rather than doing a PowerPoint, what we've done is produced a booklet which goes into far more detail about what I'm going to cover. The reason for doing emerging trends in activist campaigning is because when we have visited clients face to face, quite often I get asked, what sort of trends are you seeing developing? And I normally can come up with one or two ideas, but I thought it needed to be done more rigorously. So what we've done over the past 3 months is we've spotted new trends and strategies emerging. We've made a note of them and built up on them to produce these 14 that we've identified. So by definition, it's not going to be absolutely exact as a science, and it is relatively subjective. But I think what we have done in this process is certainly found a number of important trends that activist groups are developing and campaign groups are using. And what one finds with the internet and with websites, when one group develops a successful tactic, then others will copy. And so it's quite important in looking at new tactics to know that it may not affect you at the moment, but it could do in the future. One of the aspects of the mainstream campaigning organisations that we've noted over the years is that it's very easy just to regard them as political groups, but organisations such as World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Humane Society, they eventually become so big and employ so many people, they eventually start operating like small to medium-sized companies, and they need to be constantly successful, otherwise they have to start making staff redundant. And they pick up a sort of momentum, and therefore even more so they're constantly looking at other organisations to see what they've done that they can actually copy. So you see this process happening at an activist level and at a mainstream campaigning organisational level, where new ideas and new tactics quickly permeate. So the first one we noticed is that a tendency relatively recently to start targeting company employees directly. And a good example of that quite recently was the Canadian coat manufacturer, Canada Goose. And they've been campaigning against Canada Goose because they use fur. And activists in Canada obtained a list of employees' email addresses and have been emailing, and clearly it came from a leak from within the company, but have been emailing them directly to ask them to understand why they're campaigning and to do what they can to influence the company and give them any help by passing them in information. And increasingly, I think, as activist groups get hold of internal mailing lists, as often happens with animal rights groups, they will actually use that more. Previously, it was just used for sending relatively abusive messages to them, but it will be used increasingly to encourage them either to lobby the company internally or to help the group by passing on information. The second area which started off in the United States was a realization that freedom of information gave them a lot of power, predominantly to get hold of reports that had been written by federal agencies investigating allegations of, in the case of animal rights activists, animal abuse within those companies. And and campaigners over there realized that what federal agencies were likely to do with that information perhaps wasn't going far enough. So what we've had is what I've sort of flooding requests, initially targeting universities and more so now companies that involve federal work, because like in the UK, freedom of information can really only apply to official organisations. And once they've got those reports, they forensically examine them and quite often will discover evidence of abuse, which then they can turn into another formal complaint against that particular institution. And in the UK, we've obviously got the Data Protection Act. And quite a few companies who are targeted by animal rights groups have had requests for any information that they hold on that particular activist. And what we've always said from when we set up Welund 10 years ago, Welund produces articles. It's technically a publication. It's no different from the Times Online that you subscribe to. And therefore, it has a somewhat elegant protection under the Data Protection Act, which doesn't actually cover journalists. And on a number of occasions when clients have received data protection requests from activist groups, their legal advice has been, you do not have to hand over anything on Welund because it's an article, it's a publication. And so that always, rather than actually producing reports to companies, it's always provided us and them as clients with a degree of protection. But increasingly, we're seeing this growth of freedom of information requests. That's the second area. Third area, again touching on animal rights activists, but you can see this tendency to respond to what the police are doing to make it either more difficult for the police or to make them far more effective, is that as the police develop a new tactic to deal with direct action protests, those carrying it out will modify their tactics. And with animal rights in the 1970s, you had a situation where they started to emulate urban terrorist groups, and then and they had a sort of, the ALF at the time was a formal organisation. When that got when they got imprisoned, they then developed a cell-like structure, which was more difficult, but fairly intense work by the police 6-7 years ago stopped that. And so what animal rights activists have now moved on to, there are some covert attacks, but they've now developed a far more sophisticated form of campaigning, whereby the mainstream groups have become more radical, and the extremist groups have realised that the mainstream groups such as PETA and Animal Aid and all of those can be very effective. So perhaps 15 years ago, animal rights groups weren't actually achieving very much, but today they're achieving a huge amount. And what we do in Welund is every Friday we have a section called Roundup, where we list the successes that activist groups have achieved and the new campaigns that they've launched. And every week there's several animal rights campaigns have actually achieved something. And although this is a sort of in a sense, a new tactics. It's also something that's been happening a long time. And I remember during the road protests, activists worked out this way of blocking a road by erecting a tripod, and they could quite quickly put three poles together, tie them together at the top, and an activist would sit on the top. And it was a little bit difficult for the police to remove them. And then a few weeks later, down at Newbury, the police turned up, and the activist was sat on top of this, and they said, "You're not going to get me off." And the police produced 3 skateboards, put them under the 3 poles, and simply wheeled them off the road, and said, "Well, your problem, get down," as they're on the side of the road, and they carried on. But what I found quite interesting with an action at London City Airport a few months ago, they erected a tripod in the middle of the runway, and the tripod wasn't very high. And when the first pictures came over Twitter, I thought, well, it's only going to take them a few minutes just to sort of carry that off the runway. But what they hadn't bargained for, and perhaps the activists hadn't realised was going to happen, was as the police turned up, then health and safety intervened and pointed out, even though he was only about 6-7 feet off the ground, that there were health and safety implications. And it took about 6 hours for the activists to be removed. So in a sense, the sort of it's turned, and tripods have become far more effective. So as I say, where you're faced with a protest that the police can respond to, all the time activists are looking at ways in which they can modify their tactics to get around that. The fourth area has been in the past few months. It's been an issue since the 1980s, a concern about gentrification. But that's taken off increasingly in London, and you've had a revival of, it calls itself an activist group, it's more a sort of an anarchist group, it's more a sort of pseudo-anarchist group called Class War that's been getting involved in these protests against gentrification in London, against gated communities, and they've been particularly targeting estate agents that are selling expensive properties. And some of it has involved fairly aggressive direct action against them. There was a case where they were protesting against Foxtons, and they sort of I was close to one of those protests, and it wasn't particularly pleasant. There was no direct violence, but it was you felt it was not pleasant. And what Foxtons do whenever there's a protest, they now close their branches. So again, anti-gentrification campaigning is something that's picking up quite significantly. The next area that we saw that's happening is directly targeting chief executives through emails. Now, ordinarily, one would have thought that that shouldn't really have any effect, because most chief executives are, wise, intelligent, very capable people. And why would they be affected by a group of activists sending emails? But it's a tactic that Greenpeace has been using relatively recently in its campaign against oil companies. It's been targeting chief executives, because Greenpeace has realised that although in theory this tactic shouldn't really work, that it does seem to be having some effect. That the chief executive saying, well, I have had 1,000 emails, then obviously there must be some concern about this. Whereas in reality, Greenpeace can get 1,000, it can get 10,000 emails sent out just by sending one mailing to all of its supporters saying, please send a message. And in fact, what organisations such as Greenpeace do is not just sending an email to their supporters. They say, just click on this link, put your name in, and we will automatically send that email to that particular company. So again, it's something which I always thought wouldn't work, but the fact that it's being done by these big organisations who've got that ability to do this mass mailing suggests that it does work. Another one, a quite recent one, is a realisation that these bigger organisations, they have relatively fixed budgets, their supporters give a fairly fixed amount, and sometimes they would like to do a new initiative which costs a lot more money. And so what they've been doing is they've been using crowdfunding as a way of raising money. Now again, if you've got 1,000, 10,000 supporters, sending out an email, and quite often what they'll do is they'll use it to pay for advertisements in newspapers, which can perhaps cost 30,000, 40,000 £5, but if you're mailing enough people and say if each of you donates £5, then we'll pay for it, then quite quickly they actually raise enough money to do it. And it's also a tactic that smaller groups are now using. One of the problems that small campaign groups have had with legal actions is, even though perhaps £2,000 or £3,000 is not a lot for Greenpeace, it is quite a lot for a small local protest group. But by doing a crowdfunding campaign, they can quite quickly raise that money to pay for the legal costs. So again, use of crowdfunding is a growing tactic, and it's one that provides that is a new threat, because it means that smaller groups can actually now mount judicial reviews, and bigger groups can fund big advertising campaigns which previously their budgets might not have allowed them to do. The seventh one which we identified was a form of secondary targeting, and that's targeting advertisers. In the days of Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, when they were campaigning against Huntingdon Life Sciences, and Huntingdon Life Sciences was being supported by the government effectively, they decided to target its accountants, its bankers, its suppliers, its customers. So you had secondary targeting, and when those secondary targets refused to budge, you target their suppliers and bankers and whatever. So then you had tertiary targeting. And so that's a tactic. Secondary targeting is a tactic that's been around for about 20 years. And although it was regarded in the early days as something slightly extreme, it's now being used by a lot of the main campaign groups. It's regarded as a very acceptable tactic. But what we're seeing now is they're now moving on to advertisers in publications that they don't particularly like, which inevitably is the Sun and the Daily Mail. And there's been a number of campaigns led against companies which have been advertising in those publications. And also it's something that's spread across to the United States against against magazines and websites that are seen to be supportive of Donald Trump. And this means that for some big companies that rely very much upon advertising, and advertise in this case, the Daily Mail or the Sun, they're being told, by advertising these papers, it means that you are actually subscribing to their racist or fascist views, and their race hate and their opposition to migrants and all these issues that get activists agitated. And therefore, the only way of cleansing yourself of these ethical sins is not to advertise. And incredibly, they have actually succeeded in getting one or two companies to actually stop advertising. And at the same time, they're targeting supermarkets and other retailers that actually sell those papers. It's quite difficult these days to buy a copy of the Sun in Liverpool, because that was one of the gripes about its coverage of Hillsborough. The next area that's experienced a very rapid growth recently is low-pay campaigning. Now that started originally started very small against banks, initially in the City of London, and then it spread over to Manhattan. And what they would say is that these banks, where senior directors and employees were earning millions, and because they'd subcontracted their cleaning services, the cleaners were on a minimum wage. And I was told by a few years ago by one of our clients that I said, why have you suddenly decided to give in to these campaigners? Because the banks had initially said, well, no, it's not our problem, it's the subcontractors, target subcontractors, not it. And they said, oh, it was a spat between our chief executive and the chief executive of one of our arch rivals, and he wanted to sort of embarrass him and to show how ethical he was. So he said, no, we're going to pay our cleaners more, what are you going to do? And so you had this sort of targeting of cleaners in the city and over in Wall Street for a number of years, but it's suddenly taken off with the growth of the gig economy, whereby you've got a number of campaigns, and they're run by both anarchist groups and one or two small anarchisty type linked trade unions, because of course the people who work for these companies as dispatch riders or drivers or whatever, obviously aren't members of unions. So, and it's been seen by these anarchist groups as a way, who are always critical of the big unions, as a way in which they can actually get involved and get them stirred up. And so what you have in the UK is campaigns aimed at Uber and companies like that. And in the United States, they've been going for the predominantly McDonald's, but also some of the other food chains, and demanding a minimum wage. And so as this gig economy grows, I think you'll find more of this sort of campaigning, and then it will spread to companies which are deemed to be paying their workers too low. And there's the idea of, well, you know, low pay legislation is okay, but we want a living wage, a working wage, and they add all the sorts of things that you need to have a minimum standard of living, such as the car and several televisions and so on. The next area which I find slightly amusing, given their criticism of the way in which large corporations behave, is that Greenpeace initially, but now a lot of other organisations, have been headhunting key activists. So they look at these smaller activist campaign groups, which often emerge not quite spontaneously, but certainly sort of pop up, organisations such as, a good example being Plain Stupid, which popped up from nowhere. And they then look at them and they say, well, there are some very, very capable people in these organisations, and they really should be in our organisation. And so the reason Plain Stupid largely disappeared was because all of its key activists were picked up by World Development Movement and Greenpeace, leaving the useless activists. And then there was one of the key animal rights activists, the chap called Luke Steele. Now he's quite interesting because he also demonstrates the way in which activist extreme animal rights groups, and he went to prison for what he did, are now regarded as acceptable by the mainstream organisations. And so Luke Steele, we always Nick's a great follower of Luke Steele, and whenever we spot him, I get an email from Nick saying, "Here he is again." And we were surprised that Luke Steele, he'd come out of prison, and we thought, well, you know, who's going to touch him as a convicted animal rights activist? And he then was recruited by one of the big animal rights organisations, Animal Aid, who quite clearly saw he was a highly committed campaigner. And now People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals has come along and offered him a higher salary, so they sort of headhunted him. So again, in the way in which I said, these large organisations almost emulate large corporations. They've got their sort of almost headhunters picking off the key people. And there was another one, a chap called Paul Moroso, who was one of the, he was sort of a hippie-like character who'd been campaigning against the No M11 up in London. He'd never had a job, but he was recognised by Greenpeace as a phenomenally capable campaigner. And he is now a Greenpeace campaigner. So you've got this rivalry between these organisations as they look for key people and offer them jobs. Actually, during one big May Day protest in the city, I did come across somebody who came up to me, and he'd been one of the more prominent No M65 campaigners, who's always for climbing on diggers and getting evicted from trees. And he came up to me and he said, "Hi Paul, how are you?" You know, and thinking I was a sympathetic journalist. And I said, I see you've followed that advice about disguising yourself as a banker. And he goes, no, I am a banker. So ironically, he'd been sort of taken on by a bank, not realising his sort of background. I said, are you still sort of, he said, well, I'm sympathetic, but my job's more important. So he said, I'm not going to start throwing bricks at my employer over there. So the next area is what we're beginning to see is joint campaigning by the mainstream organisations. Now, this really never happened until very recently. They all were very proud in protecting their brand. They didn't want to be associated because, at the end of the day, with any specific field of campaigning, these groups are rivals of each other. But they realised that rather like the way in which shops, such as sort of clothes shops, all moving to a certain area, and that the effect of them being close to each other was greater than being separate, these mainstream groups have realised that by running joint campaigns actually benefits both of them, and they can be far more effective. So recently you've had Viva, an animal rights campaign, team up with Animal Aid in the UK to run a joint campaign. Greenpeace is one that's always been reluctant, but more recently we've seen them working with other organisations. Generally not Friends of the Earth, because Greenpeace people regard them as completely, it's a bit like sort of Catholics and Methodists, you know, just will not associate with each other. But Greenpeace will work with some of the smaller national organisations that it doesn't regard as a threat. And in the United States, you've got a very effective organisation called the Animal Legal Defence Fund, which mounts legal actions against companies and universities. And generally it's quite successful, but it's increasingly been working with some of the mainstream organisations and said where they may be launching a legal action, well, let us do it for you, and then it benefits as a mutually beneficial. So we've got, as I say, the 10th area was that of this joint mainstream campaigning, which we're seeing. The next one, which again was one Nick pointed out to me, was as they decided they were going to stop, animal rights activists decided they were going to stop airlines transporting animals for experimentation. And they gradually worked their way through the airlines, and they got them to pledge they wouldn't handle live animals. And then as one or two organisations who were involved in it were successful, you found that other organisations would actually say, no, that was our success. So you'd have an announcement from British Airways, whoever, saying, we won't transport animals. And then you'd have Animal Aid saying, our campaign's been successful. People for the ethical treatment of animals have said, our campaign has been successful. Quite often it's the case that the reason a company has made a change in policy has had nothing to do with these protests. But the danger is that the way in which the announcements are made, quite often you'll find organisations will actually claim credit for what's happened. And the reason they do that is that they can go to their supporters and say, look how successful we've been, and therefore give us more money. Because what you find with these organisations, behind the scenes, they've got a very efficient fundraising operation. And you find that where they carry out a big action, whether it be animal rights or environmental, they will then send a mailing to their supporters saying, this action costs us quite a bit of money, will you donate, make another donation? And what sustains most of these big organisations is these armchair supporters who really don't know any better whether they were responsible for what has happened. And therefore, even if you're a big company that doesn't give in to any of these protests, it doesn't mean that simply because you've changed your policy on a particular issue, you haven't got activist groups claiming credit for what's happened. The next area is that of the 12th area is what I put setting legal precedents. Now, that can be both a formal legal precedent, but also where activists are arrested on a protest and they go to court and the charges are dismissed, even though it may not technically be a precedent, activists know that next time round the police are far likely to arrest them if the last batch of activists have actually gone to court and had the charges dismissed. And so what you're actually finding is that for an activist to be arrested, that quite often is the start of a lengthy battle, because first of all, the court gives them an opportunity, gives them a platform to put forward their arguments. And secondly, there's a very good chance that they can actually either have the case dismissed, quite often because the police's evidence isn't good enough, even though it's got that far, but also because they can actually persuade a judge or a magistrate that they're behaving in a perfectly correct manner and they shouldn't have been charged in the first place. And you also find there was a particular important case a few weeks ago where Unison went to court over and argued that staff should be told of major changes that were taking place in the company, and the court ruled in favour of Unison. So not quite activist related, but it has had a big effect on companies, and in future, as a result of that ruling, it means that companies will have to inform staff when they're making major changes. And quite often you get anti-arms trade activists who will be arrested already. At the D-side protest a few weeks ago, a lot of them were arrested for carrying out a blockade, and already they're going to court and are being released. And what they'll do is they'll go to court, and I think when they'll either plead guilty just to get over and done with, or they'll say, well, because weapons were being sold or promoted at this arms fair, which we believe were legal, we were actually behaving in a legal manner because we were preventing a greater crime taking place. And although that defence doesn't always work, they do know they stand a good chance of doing that. So you're finding increasingly activist groups are taking on, rather than accepting being convicted, they're actually fighting the case in court, and on many occasions they're actually winning. The next and penultimate one is what I've called the soft direct action. Now, normally, direct action is when an activist breaks the law in the full knowledge that they can be arrested and that they can be convicted and that they accept the consequences. And obviously, that means far less of them will actually carry out that action. So what they've started to do is this idea of carrying out direct action, but not going so far as getting arrested. Now, a good one was with the fracking protests. They've started doing what they call slow walking, simply walking down a village, a country lane, where they've got lorries behind them trying to get to a fracking site, and they walk extremely slowly. So they say to police, well, we're not actually breaking the law, we're merely walking down. We're not stopping, we're not blocking the highway, but we're walking very slowly. And that had quite a big effect on fracking activities in the UK. But recently the police have just become a little bit intolerant of it and said, no, we're now going to arrest you for obstructing the highway. And it'll be interesting to see what the courts say. Another one in London is protests, climate change campaigners, but protesting against pollution. And they did a blockade quite close to here in Trafalgar Square a few days ago, where they simply blocked the road for a fixed amount of time, because they know when they do that, there's an inbuilt delay time between when the police have to get there and then a senior officer has to get there, and a senior officer has to ask an even more senior officer whether he can actually do something about arresting them. And by that time, they've actually moved away. So they completely blocked off the area around Trafalgar Square for 15 minutes or so, moved away and had a sort of party. But they're gradually escalating these protests. And these are things that get picked up by social media, and they're fairly confident they're going to do a big one in November. So again, you'll probably have several hundred people moving onto the street. It's a bit like the critical mass protest that started about 20 years ago, where at the last Friday of every month, and now it happens in hundreds of cities around the world, and just a group of cyclists will cycle around very slowly saying, well, we're not stopping, we're just moving. And there's absolutely nothing the police have been able to do about it. And if you're stuck behind one of them, then you just have to say you're going to be late home for work because there's nothing can be done. And very effective for them, very effective form of protest. And these soft direct actions, I think we'll see more of them happening in the future. And of course, because there's little chance of arrest, it means more activists are going to involve. And the final one is that of, I touched upon it, the concept slightly earlier, is that of very sophisticated mass lobbying. Now, theoretically, Greenpeace as an organisation could actually get millions of people sending an email, but they realised that would first of all completely block up email systems and won't have any effect. So what you actually find is through selective use of their mailing list, they can actually get the right number of people to send messages to their targets. Now that may be a company saying you're behaving unethically, it may be civil servants, it may be a consultation exercise that they're involved in. And a very effective area has been planning authorities, because councillors who are members of plans committees get emails sent to them saying, oh, I'm a bit concerned about this or that. And if they get a lot of emails, most of them don't actually stand back and say, this is actually a national campaign that's targeting us, rather than an indication of any public concern. And I saw that where I actually live. I was talking to one of our local councillors, and I said, she said, she's about 80 years old, but she's still all there. And she said, you know, Paul, she said, this request to ban hunting in these local woods, you know, there's a lot of public concern about it. I've had about 1,000 emails from local people. And I said, no, you've had 1,000 emails, but I'm willing to bet if you look at where they come from, they've been all over the world, because it was an animal rights group, and they said, send this. And although it's something which, if you stand back and look at it, you should simply dismiss as a small group of activists, it does actually have an effect. And because of the lobbying, and this is just a local thing, because of the lobbying, they voted to ban hunting on the basis of the widespread public disquiet. And I'm willing to bet the number of people from the immediate area are probably only the few dozen animal rights activists that organised it in the first place. Anyway, there's my 14 emerging tactics and strategy. As I said, it's not. I could probably list you 50, and hopefully, if this gets good reception, next time we do a seminar, we'll perhaps do another 14 or 15 tactics which have emerged at the time. Because what's important to understand about activist protest, it changes all the time. It's a bit like, for Star Trek fans, it's a bit like this Borg of changing their frequencies. You know, as they meet an obstacle, the activists will work a way around it and become far more effective. And what we see, what we list in, as I say, every week in the roundup section of Welund, is those campaigns that have been successful. And even just totting them up over a few weeks, you can see that activists and campaign groups are costing companies many millions of pounds and dollars, because all the time they're succeeding and they're having an effect. And as they increasingly exchange ideas and tactics, I think in the future they'll become even more effective. Shall I take questions?
Yeah, please.
Now,
Yeah.
No questions? And I'm around later.
Thank you very much, Paul. Right, Adam, hand over to you, please.
Yeah.
Hello everybody. Thank you, I'm Adam. It's good to hear from Paul. I'm relatively new to Welund, and as the younger person I was given the task of talking about social media, which some of you may know what that is, I hope. And what I'm going to say today is how relevant social media is, how it's used by activists, and how I've used it in campaigns, and how you can tell the difference between it being a genuine grassroots issue, or as Paul was hinting on before, it being something that's led by a small group of people. They're able to make it look like it's a bigger team, it's a big group. So why do people use social media? Well, essentially it's free, it is cheap, it's free, everyone can have Twitter. There's an anonymity to it, in that you haven't got to say who you are, you don't appear and show your face, you can hide on a computer somewhere. And it's safe and there's no risk. It's unlike being at a protest, you're not likely to get hurt, you're not going to lose a day off work, you're not going to get arrested, there's no court. It's very rare that anybody, apart from inciting violence and hatred on Twitter or Facebook, I can say your company's all sorts of things, I just can't threaten to make an attack. That would be illegal. Most people would know that was reasonable, so it's relatively safe. The tactic is to raise awareness, which is used an awful lot by groups saying, I know this is a problem, but I want to spread it to the wider world. Well, I can go on Twitter or Facebook and spread that message very quickly, much faster than sending letters and emails going out on the news. Instant. You can sort of contact celebrities. I do use the term loosely. People who have millions of followers, and you think, well, if Kim Kardashian thinks this is important, then automatically 3 million people around the world think it's important as well. And it's very much armchair activism. You can like a page on Facebook rather than going out actually doing something you think you've contributed. They feel happy, they think they've helped save the world, when in actual fact it's just another number on a screen. So I'm going to start with Twitter, which is the most common platform used. So you can have one account per email address, which essentially means any one person can have an infinite number of emails and so an infinite number of Twitter accounts. There's no real identification, you don't have to exist as a person, no birth certificate, nothing like that. You can set up as an individual, so a person, or as an organisation, group, charity, activist group, anything like that. So many people have multiple accounts. It's quite common. You have one for work, you have a personal one, maybe you run a social media account on behalf of your business. There's the possibility of impersonation. I could set up an account and call myself Fred. No one would know otherwise. I could always say I worked for one of your businesses. No one would be able to prove otherwise. And it's this idea of I can say I'm somebody, I'm interested in an issue, or I live in a certain place. You haven't got to be honest. The eggs are what you get when you start on Twitter in your profile picture. The majority of accounts, actually more than 50%, still have the egg notification on their profile picture. Implies they set it up, they used it for something, and they left it. So most of Twitter is actually dormant and left behind. And the simple thing on Twitter is you follow people and they follow you back. People you follow, they read your tweets, and people you're following, you get to read theirs. So the jargon which people use about Twitter is trending, which is a popular issue. This is what a lot of people are tweeting about. Any one time, it's the top 10 things being tweeted about by volume of original tweets, which I will come on to. The reach is the number of people who have actually had your tweet on their timeline. Now that's distinct. So if I send out a tweet to all 100 followers, that's 100 reaches. Distinct number of people, you only get to see it once. Whereas impressions is the number of times your tweet has appeared. So if it's retweeted, that counts as 2, and if it's retweeted again, that's 3. So the same tweet can be viewed by people multiple times. It gives this impression that you've done an awful lot of work, but really, if I showed one person something twice, I've only showed it to one person. Twitter doesn't quite agree. So some ideas of trends. It's not a great picture, but I took this as a screenshot on a Thursday of last week. There was a news story about Bayern Munich, which got 361,000 tweets. I think that was within an hour. So that's the sort of volume on Twitter. The one interesting story was that Scottish Dawn, a right-wing group in Scotland that was banned, which managed to trend with just over 1,000 tweets. So just because something is trending doesn't mean it's popular. Probably got more than 1,000 followers. The Thursday lunchtime is probably not the best time to be on Twitter. For instance, the Great British Bake Off at the beginning of this season managed to get over 1 million tweets within an hour. So it does depend on the time of day, and people are aware of that if you want to make an issue, when everyone else is at work, people pick Monday lunchtime and be able to get something trending on Twitter, so critical of a business. And it's trending, but really haven't done that much work, because unlike it being a Friday evening when everyone's sat at home on their phones, where you would need a much higher rate to be trending, you can very easily manipulate these statistics, and they can go back to their members and say, because of your hard work on Twitter, we managed to get this issue, this campaign trending on Twitter for the whole world to see, without really being honest and saying only a few, well in this case, 1,000 tweets were actually sent. The difference between the two columns being that you can have trends which are local and trends which are national, and they do vary slightly, in that anyone on Twitter could be anywhere in the world. It's based on their IP address where they've just logged in. So the idea of something trending, it could be relevant in Hong Kong but not really in London, or vice versa. Or you could be anywhere in the country and you are spreading a message everywhere. It's probably not even relevant. Most of your customers are probably not viewing that. Or more importantly, people who are viewing it might not even have bothered to research where your company's based or anything like that. They can be all over the world. The comparison of impressions versus reach is, I think, quite important. A lot of people who use Twitter, there's a Twitter analysis function which will tell you the number of people you've made an impression of in any given 28 days. And a lot of groups, Greenpeace, for instance, will at the end of the month email their members and activists and say, this month we have managed to reach so many million people. And actually they often go for the impressions as opposed to the reach. So if it's a simple idea, I had 100 followers and Paul had 200, obviously he's more popular than I am. But if there were 40 people who were followers of both of us, then the 300 impressions only means 260 people saw it. Now, as you can imagine, on a much bigger scale, a lot of these groups, they follow each other, they share it with their friends, and whilst Greenpeace can boast of having an impression on millions of people, the reality is it's much fewer distinct individuals, and it's even fewer when you get rid of the ones who have multiple accounts. So you can quite quickly go from being one person with a phone to hitting up 1 million impressions, but that does not mean 1 million people have had an issue as part of a campaign. It doesn't mean it's 1 million people who really care that much. It's just the way you look at the numbers. And I've just completed a maths degree, so numbers are my favourite, which I've just got to. So the relevance of this on a much bigger scale is the Green Party, nobody here follows them, they have 213,000 followers. This is the same party who only have just over 45,000 members. So obviously there's people who bother to be involved, pay their subscription. Then there's the ones who think, if I give a follow on Twitter or like on Facebook, I've instantly saved the world. Caroline Lucas also has 263,000 followers, and this is somebody who got just over 25,000 votes in the last election. So clearly, most of those followers do not live in Brighton, they're not her constituents, they're just people around the world with an interest. There is a nice piece of software, which you can ask me about later, which lets me know that they have 150,000 followers who are the same. And so as I've shown on the board, if they send a tweet, they often retweet one another. They like say, share this message from our MP or from our party, which they claim has been seen by 476,000 people. But in fact, it's been seen by a lot of people twice. So there's only really 326,000. That still sounds like a lot. That's 46% overestimation, which in anyone's books is quite a lot. If I said to you, I've spoken to 10 activists, I could actually say I've spoken to some of them twice. I spoke to 15 activists. That's less people at the protest, that's less people really bothered about the issue. Now, this is just between two people. As you know, there are allegedly 2 billion Twitter users, although there's only about 1 billion of those are active at any given year, and within any given week it's about 500 million. So Green Party have about 80 Twitter accounts, various local areas, counties, constituencies, boroughs. So between 80 accounts, and approximately 70% of those followers are also following the main party and Caroline Lucas, which only means 30% of each one are actually any unique people who just follow them. So for instance, if you follow London Green Party, there's a 70% chance you also follow the Green Party nationally, which doesn't mean there's a lot of people in London who are interested. It just means they follow because it says Green Party. They really don't care where they're from. It's a sort of, even more of them I can follow. I've saved the world multiple times. As you can see on the screenshot, there's just many examples you can find on Twitter of accounts which are official. They're run by someone in the Green Party, but they're probably run by the same people. They've got the same follower base. It does not mean that they're hitting millions of people. They're just hitting the same people over and over again. A nice little showing of this is anyone who has done mathematics. That's the top one now has 5 points, and so imagine that's 5 Twitter accounts. Now between them there are 10 connections, so 10 people being followed. If you follow each other back, you've got 20 connections between 5 people. So I can say, well, 20 people have seen this, but it's just bounced around the same 5. When you obviously put that up to 80 accounts, you have to do 80 times 70 and take out the comments, and you've got 6,320 connections. So if I had 80 Twitter accounts, I could automatically boast having 6,320 followers across different ideas, where it's one group following themselves back and forwards can automatically say every time we tweet something, it gets seen by 6,300 people. There's probably a few students in an office who are actually doing that work, and people can think this, some great campaign people are really bothered about. And it's a simple idea of it being a network, and Twitter is very dense. With everyone in the world, if everyone had Twitter, there would only be at most 5 steps between, I've heard this before, between everybody. So I would know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows the person I'm trying to contact. That's very dense. So, like you can see there are sort of lots of lines in a sense. It means most activists in a particular group, political wing, and a campaign group tend to sort of stick together. They all know one another, they follow one another. And it gives us an idea of a very dense, compact network, as opposed to many people scattered around. That would be worse if there were genuinely, 6,320 people involved. The fact is, you can achieve that number with just 80 Twitter accounts. Then we come on to interactions, which a lot of people who also use Twitter analysis look at the number of interactions they've had sent to them. So to get an interaction, you can either be mentioned. So I could say, I didn't like, my trip to Institute of Directors today, and say something critical, and they will receive that message. But every time someone replies to that, someone else can say, yeah, I was there too, didn't like it. That's the second interaction. Someone can retweet my original message, third interaction. Or you can favourite your messages. So, again, I have 5 Twitter accounts on my phone, so if my first tweet is that sort of blue dot in the middle, you can very quickly add up interactions by favouriting your own tweet, retweeting your own tweet, texting your friend and saying, oh, by the way, I've just put something out, would you give me a retweet? Boost it up. So all of a sudden, that one tweet I've sent to the Institute of Directors, they can be getting 10 interactions because I've retweeted it myself. So has one person made a critical comment about the Institute of Directors, or have 10? It's very easy to add a few more in, and then you get your friends and say, oh, make sure you retweet this. They reply onto it, and that builds up. Now, people who are purely looking at the numbers, the headline figures, saying, well, today we've received 200 tweets, and they're all negative. Or have they received one tweet 200 times? Have they had one tweet which other people picked up on? So the numbers game isn't as simple as saying lots of people are interested or lots of people are really upset about a particular issue. It's more of a case of a few people who can sort of use Twitter in a very good way of saying, I will run a professional Twitter campaign and I will make sure all my friends are involved in your account, and you will think that you've had lots of interactions. Much like I could send you as many emails as I like, but they're all coming from one person. You're not getting 100 emails. There's also replies on notifications. Now, on the left, it's a bit fuzzy, but I just screenshotted some random bit of Twitter, which was actually a tweet Boris Johnson had originally sent as a Foreign Secretary, and had included another politician. Now, that tweet did actually get 170 retweets and 656 favourites on the original tweet. There were also 725 replies, most of which bore no resemblance to the original tweet at all. They weren't really bothered about the issue. By the end, 2 people were arguing about the best cat video on YouTube. But just on there were 7 replies, which between the replies to those and the retweets and the favourite, that's 250 interactions. Now, whoever runs Boris Johnson's Twitter account is probably used to having large numbers like that. But all of a sudden, a tweet that's taken off, people are interested in thinking, oh, this is funny, I'll share that to my friend, or I'll pass it on again, oh, someone's retweeted me. You can build up over 25,000 interactions, as I say, on a bigger scale, from one tweet that somebody else received. Now, the poor people who were tagged into that tweet also getting those notifications coming in, within 24 hours they got 25,000. That doesn't mean they got 25,000 critical comments. They got one. They just kept being alerted, oh, someone's retweeted a reply to something somebody said to you. and that builds up. And most of them were utter garbage. Most of it was offensive or just total junk. There was very little real content in there apart from the original tweet that had been sent. Now, if you can get rid of all of the sort of clutter and the noise and start saying, what is it people are actually saying to me, and how can I know what is a real issue and what is just junk people are picking up on? For instance, I follow East Midlands Trains on Twitter, and every time somebody tweets into them, they get a response. But there's always other people who are just generally annoyed at them, who get involved. Yeah, they did it to me as well. Oh, yeah, retweet because someone's complained. Those people are probably not on a train at the moment, but they want to feel involved. They can retweet, they can get involved, they can share someone's conversation, and automatically, Paul Solar East Midlands has received 10 complaints rather than the one legitimate complaint they originally had. Now, I've done bits of stage managed Twitter action. So one of them, perfectly legitimate, I have to say, was against a police chief constable, where local residents didn't think that their issues with crime were being taken seriously. So with a bit of help, they, 5 people, managed to keep sending tweets to the chief constable about this crime not being taken seriously and why weren't we getting any action. Now you'd assume that the chief constable's an intelligent, experienced chap. But if every time he's tagged in a tweet and these other residents, their neighbours, are replying, they're retweeting, they're saying, oh yeah, it's right, that is a problem, all of a sudden 5 factorial, because you're all sharing the same message between yourselves, it's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2, you get 120 notifications. A few days later, the chief constable took action, made sure a police officer went, even visited the area to make sure it was resolved. Because in his mind, 120 local residents were really upset about a particular issue. The fact is, it was 5 people who had a little bit of help in using Twitter. The opposite example was quite recently, and probably again very soon, Ryanair had a lot of angry customers. Every minute they were getting 30 tweets sent at them. Now they were genuine people who had been on planes or they were going to be on planes sending tweets. Most of them never got a retweet or a like because they're not an organised group. This is just, hi, I'm Adam, I was meant to be on a plane, but you cancelled it, I'm mad. As opposed to, I'm actually trying to campaign against you. So most of them are just people venting their anger. However, they only received those 30 notifications. Now, 5 people managed to get the chief constable to take action, but the 30 a minute to Ryanair is probably unlikely to affect Ryanair's business. Had they have had 120, would they thought was as bad? But in reality, they got many more people having a genuine issue than the chief constable got tweets. But it's about knowing, is this a well-run campaign? Have people been told you have to get involved and tweet this? Sometimes groups even send out an email with, this is the content to put on Twitter, or this is our tweet, make sure you favourite it. A lot of email alerts, oh, we've just started a new social media campaign, make sure you retweet to show your support. The idea that you can become part of a movement if you go on Twitter and press a button, whereas in the olden days it was you actually have to go outside and do some work. But people like to feel involved, and these groups know how to use social media. A lot of them are hiring people, my age, maybe I can get another job after this, to pay large sums of money to manage their Twitter campaigns to go against big businesses, against groups. And for instance, Greenpeace are paying a large sum of money to somebody just to use their Twitter account and to manage their social media campaigns. These aren't just members of the public who think, I've got a problem, I know, I'm going to tweet and rant at a particular business. No, these are people who are being told to do it and are doing it, and managers are thinking there's a lot of people who are involved. It's very well stage managed. The things to look for, so you know the difference between a real issue or a stage managed campaign. Many egg accounts means it's a new account. Has it just been set up to annoy you? Are they really members of the Twitter community? You can also filter out your notifications to get rid of things like people who don't follow you or people you're not interested in, and people who haven't even bothered to put a profile picture on. As I said, that's more than half the users of Twitter. Haven't bothered enough to say, I'm Adam, this is my Twitter page, and here's my picture. You haven't even got a picture of yourself. But a lot of people quickly set up an account saying, I can use this to spam, I can have a few more notifications, they'll never know who I am, so I'm safe. And you can choose to block those people out, which is quite useful in getting rid of the ones who are a waste of time. Also, people who have sort of no followers, or they haven't sent many tweets, or everything they've ever done is just attacking your business. It's not a legitimate person. So if you were angry at Ryanair about your flight being cancelled, you probably also tweeted last week what we're having for tea. It's the sort of thing people do. Rather than just somebody whose existence is being angry at a particular company. And the same tweet often gets sent multiple times. You might receive, the same wording, the same grammar, many, many times by people who have been given an email saying, please tweet this to a business because it's part of our campaign. So those are the differences. And if you do have any questions at the end or you want to talk to me, that's how you can sort of see, is something many people, 100 people all saying one thing and being upset? Or is it one tweet that's been spread 100 times? Now, I'll briefly touch on Facebook. There are a few differences with Facebook, which is you can like a page. So maybe over 500,000 people like the Greenpeace Facebook page. Again, they haven't got that many active members. It's a case of I've done something to help by pressing like. The key thing that you can use on Facebook are photos and events. A really successful Facebook post always includes a picture, or it's something emotive. People often share it without realising what they've shared. Other examples include people who have accidentally shared, say, a post from a racist group because they saw the picture and they thought, oh, this is good. They haven't even realised where it came from. And also you can sort of, say to people, this is a picture of animal cruelty. It might not even be from the place they said it's from, and they might not really know who you are, but they pick up on an image, a picture, a video, and they thought, oh, this is really sad, I'll share this, without realising actually they've been sharing something in the campaign group. Now, events can be organised on Facebook. They're not always physical events. A lot of politicians make use of events in the election and use an event called Vote For Me, essentially. So you get alerts from your phone half an hour before, at the time, keep saying to you, don't forget to do this. Much more effective than sending out emails, putting on a mailing list. You can keep hammering on someone's phone saying, don't forget to come to the protest march, or don't forget to tweet to this business and say something, or don't forget to send an email. You can invite all of your friends on Facebook at the click of a button, so suddenly 500 other people being added to the event. That means they all get the notifications about it. Whether or not they're bothered, like everyone builds in. It makes it look like it's something that's very big. There's never a realistic turnout figure from Facebook. If all of these people had arrived, I don't think you can see on the text, but one of them boasted of having over 10,000 people who attended. The pictures we have from the protest showed about 20 people. So there's no relevance at all between people who say, yeah, I'll be there. In fact, you can often look down the list and see people from all over the world were allegedly in London, where they were probably at home asleep in another country. And the activist way of using Facebook is you can't use it to directly contact a person or a group or a business. But what you can do is to sort of share an image, a video all around. And organisation on community pages, they look much more official than just, hi, I'm Adam, I'm angry about something. As opposed to, this is a group of us, it's an organisation, we belong to something, makes it sound much more emotive, much more belonging. And you can have as many pages as you want. You can have 20 pages attached to a particular issue, you can have 22 different ones, and it's very easy for them to run. Often it's a local thing, it's a single issue, but in reality, it's the same sort of thing. So if you type in, anti-fracking groups into Facebook, for instance, you can find hundreds of pages. A friend of mine recently set up a new cafe, and he sent everyone a text message saying, this is my new Facebook page, please give me a like. His friends, so I did. Half the people who liked it were his current customers already. The other half were his friends who lived all across the world who were probably never going to be able to visit. But this idea of, they've already got 200 people who like them on Facebook. So there are probably not even that many in some of the villages that these groups are set up in. They can come from all over the world, and you can say, I don't want them to be fracking in forever, so I'm going to give them a like and follow their group. Often it's it's the same 500, 1,000 activists on Facebook who follow every single group and feel like I'm a veteran campaigner because I follow 10 groups rather than just one. And there's often people in a particular area. So the frack-free Surrey, I did see people who were sort of based all over the world. They're not in Surrey, they probably don't know where Surrey is. But it's this idea that it's easy, you can just click, you can join in, you can feel like you've done something. But in reality, most of these groups haven't achieved anything. They just want to feel like they've been part of something. And often when people are looking at things on Google, you can get a link onto a Facebook page as well on Google, and people think, oh, dear, this, my company might be at risk. Well, normally it's just because there's so many links onto that page, Google put it at the top. Doesn't mean it's something people are visiting. It doesn't mean it's something people care about. It's purely based on the number of links, the number of likes and follows. So the moral of the story is that with social media, you can think you're being targeted by tens of thousands of people when it's just a few. That notifications aren't that relevant unless you're looking at how many unique individual tweets you've been sent. And also that the reason people are using social media is because it's better for them than it is to go out to a protest and potentially get arrested and lose their jobs if they have one. It's this idea of, I can do an awful lot from my phone to try and distract from what you're doing and make you think there are more of us and that we're more involved. And finally, that anyone who changes their ways because of social media, again, put a second thing up, didn't we do a good job? We've managed to change it because of your hard work, so now please give us a retweet. And these messages spread all around the world by sort of naive individuals who think they've achieved a lot, but in reality have just been pressing buttons on their phone. Now, are there any questions on social media, activism? Yes.
Just from that point of view, we found that actually we're finding that these folks are just getting more cute, and actually where historically they might have, I'm looking more at a protest angle, where they used to, kind of gain support, saying, listen guys, let's get into this place and do this and do that. We found that just obviously they've become just more aware of companies, bigger companies, having access to folks like yourselves, having their own kind of systems so that they're doing lessons that's consistent with what you're seeing. Is there ways of getting beyond that?
So I think what you're asking is, like, are there sort of hidden groups on Facebook who aren't coming out in the public trying to be active?
Well, what I'm saying, we're seeing that they've become more cuter about not overtly posting and using social media to advertise their actions.
Yes.
And are there other kind of outlets that maybe these folks are using beyond Twitter?
Yeah, no, I understand that. I mean, the first one I'd say is there are lots of groups on Facebook which are closed, they're locked. You can still see they exist, but you can't see who's in it or what they're saying. That's obviously the best way of organising. But part of what we were saying today was that when you think there's 1 million people going to attend an event, that's unlikely. Whereas those closed groups are probably much smaller and more, targeted at a particular issue. So they're not, as you say, going public on Twitter and saying, we are going to do this, please come along and help. There are ways you can get involved in see what they're doing. One of them is, as I said at the beginning, is impersonation on Facebook. If you get the right sort of account, you can quickly join into these groups. And often, these activists will say, well, since you're a member of Don't Frack in London, we'll happy to let you join Don't Frack in Surrey and Buckinghamshire and Bedfordshire as well. So that is one way of getting yourself in there or hiring someone to do it who can sort of look around what's going on as a sort of inside person. That's one of the ways. A lot of things are also sort of done on a mailing list, so they'll say to you, would you be interested in signing up to this Facebook group or coming on to something, but we won't give you the details until a later date. And those are the things by with intelligence you can still get into. Most things on the internet, because there's so many people involved, it's difficult to hide. So you can still get into a lot of those things. Did you have the same question? Or?
No, it's a different one. You mentioned an analyst tool on
Yes.
Twitter to break down the numbers. Are there any similar dinosaurs on Facebook, for instance?
I'm not sure if there are on Facebook because of the way individuals like a page. I'm not sure if there's a way of saying, well, how many distinct individuals have liked these 5 pages. But often if you go into Facebook and if you've got accounts, as I was saying, which sort of pretend you are an environmental activist, for instance, then you can often get into them and see how many mutual friends you have. And you do often see it's the same sort of big characters who are appearing in them all. But there potentially is a way. It should be something I would like to find out about. Maybe get in touch and share that around. Because definitely with Twitter, you can find out how many people who are in common between 2 accounts. There must be a way on Facebook. But often things on Facebook are much smaller as well. So even big groups on Facebook tend to have a few thousand likes, whereas on Twitter it might be a few million followers. But there are examples I've gone into and seen where actually most pages have the same 100 followers in common, but no, as far as I'm used so far, sort of distinct mathematical, there are this many, but I'm sure it must exist in the out there.
And on Twitter, it's in functionality within the app?
It's not within Twitter, it's on a separate service. There are quite a few, and I can let you know the one I use, and I can put it on an email to people. I can even show you a link to where it is. And it will just sort of give you 2 accounts, and it will say these are the number of followers they have in common, which is quite useful in saying, is it just within the same people twice, as opposed to 2 big groups of people? Yeah, I can share that. Anybody?
Just to pick up on that point with analytics on Facebook, or you can do, there's a lot of services out there that do multi-platforming apps, for instance, where you would run, say, 4 or 5 different Instagram different things feeding into your app, and they do the analytics on click counts and demographics and places in the UK that these are coming from. So although you can't do it through Facebook itself, there's other software out there that do it.
And often you find, leading on from that, people who are using those platforms will tweet and then share it on Facebook, or Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Exactly. So again, you might be getting 5 hits, but actually you're getting the same thing 5 times, and that's another thing. And often you see on Facebook things which are shared, but it begins with sort of Twitter and stars, and it doesn't quite render in the same way.
Just give a good example. The most extreme case I've seen was there was a protest in Helsinki, and it said that 20,000 people were going to support this protest, and 1 person turned up. And on another occasion, we were briefing, we were asked by a client to attend a meeting with the police to discuss discuss an action at a power station, and with the gold commander, and we had the local special branch there. And she confidently stated in her briefing that they anticipated 731 people would be attending this protest. And I said, can I ask where you got that figure from? And she said, sorry, we can't reveal our sources, confidential. I said, because by coincidence, the number of people on Facebook who said they were attending was 731. And the gold commander said, on this occasion, he said, I'm going to go with Welund's estimation of numbers. And she's not very happy with us. But so often we say that what the number of people who support a protest on Facebook merely is an indication of the number of people who have seen that Facebook, rather than the number of people that attend. And if you drill down and look at the numbers, then you get protests in, say, London, and you've got somebody in New Zealand saying they're going to attend it, and it bears no meaning. And in fact, to an extent, sometimes social media undermines protests because people feel they've supported it by saying they're going to attend rather than actually attending. So although Facebook is a very good way of publicising events, sometimes it undermines those events for the activists.
Other questions? No.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam. Alan, can we hand over to you, last but not least?
Hi, my name's Alan Fossey. I've had a career in the police for many years. And one of one of my jobs in the police, I work with the tactical support division, and much of my work in Leicestershire involved going to Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, pretending to be a football hooligan. So I had some experience of infiltrating protest groups, although they're not the sort of activist groups that we deal with now or you'd have dealt with. After I left the police, I got involved with companies that were asking me to go and do a similar thing. Probably be frowned upon big time today, but one of the things I used to do was attend AGMs. And so I'm in a place now where I can give you some information about how to respond to AGM protests, okay? That's your standard view of your AGM, big AGM, hundreds of people in attendance. And years ago, these shareholder meetings were relatively genteel affairs, sometimes a smattering of people, sometimes hundreds of people, and many of them retired would show up, a few mild questions, approve the various resolutions, then they'd tuck into the wine and sandwiches afterwards. The chairman was more likely to be challenged over the quality of the biscuits than the finer details of the balance sheet. But now, a revolution is more in the air, as investors vent their fury over a range of issues. Now, from the perspective of the company or the bank that's being targeted, these protests pose a significant threat in terms of attracting damaging media coverage, drawing shareholders' attention to allegations made by the protest groups, and demonstrating whether the company is competent in dealing with the crisis. I'm going to look at ways in which activist groups organise protests inside and outside the meetings, and analyse at the end the most effective way of responding to the threat. The first stage is identifying the threat. You need to ascertain whether an AGM is going to be the target of a protest or whether activists intend to show up as observers. I think this chap should be counted in the former. In many cases, activist groups will announce in advance that they're planning to protest against an AGM and will state whether or not they've acquired shares in the company. However, in some cases, they will not make any announcement and will instead secretly buy shares and infiltrate activists into the meeting and only then reveal their presence. Companies that are not aware that they're going to be targeted by activists but are concerned about such a possibility can take a number of basic precautions to protect themselves. The names of shareholders are in the public domain and are therefore not covered by the Data Protection Act. And this means that Welund can be supplied with a list of recent small share movements and can search for known activists and addresses from where they operate. The activists will normally acquire a block of a small number of shares, say 15, and then distribute them. And this process will often indicate that they're contemplating action inside an AGM. In both North America and the UK, there exist organisations which coordinate protests at a range of AGMs as a means of putting pressure on companies on a large range of different issues. In the UK, Share Action, which was set up a decade ago, was originally created to put pressure on pension funds and has fine-tuned the concept of engaging companies at their AGMs. To do so, it's formed what it calls its AGM army, which holds companies to account on issues like the living wage, responsible tax behaviour, renewable electricity, factory farming, and much more. Among the companies targeted in 2017 by Share Action be Severn Trent, Whitbread, Marks and Spencer's, Vodafone, number of oil and gas companies, Sainsbury's, Nestle, and many, many more. In most cases, the police will be aware that a protest is taking place at an AGM, and they will liaise closely with the company in advance. Welund has attended a number of these meetings, and they will normally involve the police officer in charge on the day, his deputy, and a special branch officer. In most cases, the police will present an extreme scenario and will have assumed that far more protesters might attend than will actually be there on the day. And as we've heard, that quite often they'll use Facebook as their indication of numbers. The primary objective of the police will be to minimise any threats to public order, and they will not necessarily be acting in the interest of the company. It's therefore important at these meetings to secure assurances that there will be sufficient police officers in attendance to counteract any illegal protest, but not so many that they make the protest appear to be more significant than it's going to be. Adam's dealt with social media in great detail, so I'm going to gloss over it a little bit. Activists organising protests at AGMs will usually make extensive use of social media, both to publicise the protest in advance and then give real-time reporting on what's happening on the day. If an overt protest is taking place outside the meeting, they'll normally set up a Facebook site, and it'll be used to invite people to attend the protest, and companies will sometimes mistakenly assume that people who say they will attend is an indication of the size of the protest. As we've heard, the reality is on most occasions the number of those who say they'll turn up on Facebook falls way short of the numbers that actually attend. So Facebook should never be relied upon as an accurate gauge as the level of protest of an AGM protest. However, Facebook can be valuable in outlining what the issues are for the activists and highlighting the lines of argument that they're likely to take. It can also give a clue as to the type of activists that are planning to attend a meeting and reveal whether the company should be prepared for a passive or an aggressive protest, identifying if any of the more capable campaigners are taking an interest in the event. We've heard about Twitter. It should be monitored closely for indications as to who will be attending and what their arguments are likely to be. When activist AGM protests started in the 1990s, companies would take care to ensure that video cameras were confiscated at the door so that actions inside the meeting could not be recorded. On one occasion, a video activist, his name's Roddy Mansfield, I think he's now a Sky news producer, he obtained a media pass for the G7 summit at the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre in Westminster in order to conceal a camcorder inside the building for the BAE AGM, which is happening the following week. The advent of smartphones these days with high resolution, high resolution video cameras means that this is now impossible. As a consequence, activists will record events and transmit images in real time during AGMs. As well as being used for recording and publicising activist protests inside the meeting, smartphones means that particular care should be taken when using security guards to remove disruptive activists, because any evidence of excessive use of force will be used to substantiate complaints of assault to the police. Activist intelligence gathering. AGMs provide a valuable opportunity for activist groups to gather critical intelligence about a company which can be used to assist their campaigning. It also gives them an opportunity to put direct questions to the chairman. A number of ethical investment groups own shares in major companies to enable them to receive reports and attend AGMs. Activist intelligence gathering takes three forms. Firstly, asking direct questions at the meeting. Second, passive monitoring of the meeting. And thirdly, talking to senior executives and board members before and after the meeting to gain useful information about its activities. If the company is the target of an activist protest, they will be attempting to discover what impact they're having. I'm now going to talk a little bit about actual tactics, and we'll start with tactics outside the meeting. Now, activist groups do not necessarily need to enter an AGM in order to have an impact, and will often protest outside the meeting. On some occasions, they'll actually protest inside and outside to intensify the effect. Now, although a protest outside the meeting is usually the responsibility of the police, or guards, if it's on private property, it can often have a significant impact both on the way in which shareholders react and the media reports on the event. Simply because the protesters don't intend to enter the meeting doesn't mean what they're planning to do outside should not be taken into account. Firstly, deal with private property. Before an AGM, it's sensible to identify who owns the space outside a venue. If it is public, then discussions should take place with the police to ascertain what their attitude towards a protest will be. If it's privately owned, it may be the case that the owner will not tolerate protest and will take action themselves. Having protesters removed, even if the guards are working for the property owner, may be counterproductive. Either way, it makes sense to decide what one's attitude towards an external protest is, and then work with the owner or the police to help ensure that it does not disadvantage the company. An old favourite of activists around the world, the die-in or lock-on across the entrance. The common activist tactic is to mount a blockade on entrance in order to impede access to a building. Although this is not unknown at AGMs, it's likely to be regarded by more seasoned activists as potentially unproductive, given that their aim is to influence the company and or its shareholders. Groups that attempt to block entrances, or in more extreme cases, storm meetings, are usually reacting to recent news that's anchored them and not given them enough time either to acquire shares or stage a more sophisticated protest. One of the primary objectives of AGM protests is to generate media coverage. Campaigners know that picture editors are often short of interesting images to brighten up their financial pages. A picture of a colourful and interesting action outside an AGM can often generate coverage for a protest that might otherwise have been ignored. And that was outside BAE Systems AGM some years ago. As you can see by the next slide, it's generating a lot of media interest, and those pictures appeared in the papers the next day. Now, most AGM protests are non-confrontational, but occasionally activists become so incensed about a company they organise a noise protest outside the meeting in an attempt to drown out the speakers. It's usually possible to discover in advance whether an AGM is going to be targeted with this kind of action. It should then be possible to ascertain whether a meeting venue is vulnerable to noise protest and take appropriate precautions. You can see here these actually singing underneath an air vent, and apparently it was heard inside. But I'm going to show you a short video. It was, while I went past it. Activists tend to regard genuine shareholders as potential allies, and even if they're not planning to enter the meeting, they can sometimes persuade them to ask the board pertinent questions. If activists are planning a protest inside the AGM, getting a number of genuine shareholders on site can often significantly improve their impact. There have been occasions when genuine shareholders have protested to the chairman during an AGM when activists have been forcefully removed after carrying out a protest. And this is one area where organisations such as Share Action have had the greatest impact. Working alongside institutional investors, they've sought to highlight issues such as remuneration policy and corporate bonuses, and when they have intervened in AGMs, made them one of the key issues. I'll give you an example here. In the 2014 Barclays Bank AGM, Share Action noted, I'll just quote, "When Standard Life Investment, one of the biggest shareholders in Barclays and one representing millions of pension savers, spoke up to note their opposition to the corporate bonuses handed out in 2013, disaster struck." Now, Alison Kennedy, who is the Governance and Stewardship Director at Standard Life Investments, announced that, acting on behalf of its clients, she had instructed its proxy to vote against a resolution which approved the remuneration report. In response, the company chairman responded that he had no intention of apologising. Now, whether or not the board is correct is immaterial. What a campaign group had succeeded in doing is working alongside a significant institutional investor to cause embarrassment for a large bank at its AGM, which resulted in adverse media coverage. Finally, masquerading as company representatives. Now, activists have occasionally tried a tactic whereby they disguise themselves as company representatives with uniforms and possibly pop-up displays in order to create the false impression that it believes in a particular policy. Arms trade protesters, for instance, may create a poster which looks as if it's produced by the target company, which reads XXX, killing people to make a profit. Now we move on to activist tactics inside the meeting. Now activists are aware that inside the meeting they're in effect operating behind enemy lines, and that if they're planning a disruptive action, they only have a limited amount of time before they're expelled, and the tactics that they use are designed accordingly. We go back to the lock-in, die-in and removal delay. In order to maximise disruption inside a meeting, activists have attempted to lock themselves onto furniture. If they're planning a lock-on, they will need to bring the necessary tools into the venue. Not all of them, such as thumb locks, are easy to find during body searches. Activists have also been known to lay on the floor at AGMs to play dead, suggesting they've been killed by the company. If there's a possibility of this type of action, there are 3 precautions that need to be taken. Minimise the number of lock-on points inside a meeting. This is difficult. You can see this guy here, for instance, he's locked himself with a couple of cable ties onto a chair. Secondly, place guards near known activists. And finally, liaising with the police to ensure that appropriate cutting gear is available. Now, rather than just dragging him out like that, it would have been very easy just to snip the cable ties. We go back to noise, whistles, horns, rape alarms, etc. If activists are planning a disruptive protest, there's actually if they're planning a disruptive protest inside the meetings, then they've been known to carry whistles, horns, rape alarms and other devices that can be easily concealed. Mainstream campaign groups will also often say potentially embarrassing allegations about a company until its AGM. In order to increase the chances of media coverage and add credibility to allegations, campaign groups will often bring along high-profile individuals such as Indigenous chiefs or celebrities. This can include celebrities with a large following in social media, as we've heard about already. Once they are inside, activists will often interact with genuine shareholders in an attempt to persuade them to support their protest and campaign. And activists will sometimes put forward genuine shareholder resolutions, which can often attract the support of other individual shareholders and sometimes even institutions. Although these are unlikely to win majority support, they need to be treated with care, as they can sometimes cause a company embarrassment if a significant minority of shareholders back them. It's not unknown for activists at AGMs to take objects in to throw at board members. These usually consist of vegetables, custard pies, or eggs. This gentleman here is named Gary Keogh. He threw rotten eggs at the board of Allied Irish Banks at its meeting in Dublin. Other examples: in Belgium, Fortis was forced to suspend its extraordinary meeting after the bank's investors threw shoes at the board and then sang the Marseillaise before storming the stage. ArcelorMittal annual meeting in Luxembourg was disrupted when workers set off smoke bombs inside the venue. These events are relatively rare, but in carrying out a risk assessment in advance of a shareholders meeting, it's important to question whether any activist protesters who are planning to attend will be tempted to carry out more extreme actions such as this and to plan accordingly. Activists are conscious that AGMs are held so that companies may conduct their business to a specific agenda, and that certain functions have to be carried out before the meetings end. Because venues are only booked for a set amount of time, they will sometimes use delaying tactics as a form of disruption to prevent normal business from being carried out. And a perfect example of this was about 15 years ago, again at a BAE AGM. The protests inside went on so long that the people who run the hall turned around and said, "You'll have to stop the meeting." So they had to rearrange the whole AGM for weeks later. It cost the company a fortune in time and money. Right, now we're coming on to how best to respond to activist threats. Companies will often underestimate the threat that activist groups pose and then hopelessly overreact. The most effective way of countering any activist threat is to gather as much relevant open source intelligence as possible and then make an objective assessment as to how to respond to the threat. Carrying out an AGM protest requires careful planning. With proper monitoring, it's usually possible to discover which groups are considering an action. Mainstream groups will often issue an embargoed press release, which normally gives a good indication of what they are and what they're not planning to do. Different departments of the company are likely to be involved in the AGM planning and will not necessarily know the best response. Indeed, their involvement can often turn a low-key protest into a significantly high-profile media event. It's critical that the guards used for an AGM know that how they behave can have a significant impact on the company. It's essential that they only use reasonable force, and if in any doubt whatsoever, request police assistance. It is inevitable that female protesters will be present, and so having an appropriate number of female security officers at hand is important should activists need to be searched or forcefully removed from the meeting. A small number of companies have taken the decision to ban activist shareholders from attending AGMs. Although they've complained and threatened legal action, nothing along that line has ever been done. There's a danger this response could draw undue attention to the protest, and unless used sparingly, lead to illegal action against the company, which may result in a ruling that might oblige companies to give all shareholders access to the AGM. The activists' aim in asking questions to the board is twofold. First, to embarrass the company by making allegations in front of shareholders, and secondly, to use it as an opportunity to obtain additional information about the company. It's therefore important that the chairman is fully briefed about the threat and how to respond should he be the target of an action. My very last point, briefing executives and board members. If the company is the target of an activist campaign and it's believed that they're attending as shareholders, any executives and board members should be briefed in advance to assume that any inquisitive shareholder, unless they know them personally, should be treated with caution and not told anything sensitive. And there endeth the lesson. Whether anyone's got any questions? Lawrence is shortly going to detail the Welund AGM service for you.
Yeah, any questions at this stage from anybody? No? Super. Can I just have a round of applause for all our presenters today? Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody. More information will be going out. I hope you've all got a copy of Paul's booklet. There are more of those on the table outside if you haven't got that. We'll also be following up with the slides from presenters. As Alan said, we're also launching our new AGM service, and details of that will follow by email. There are 3 tiers of package available, covering all the sorts of things we've seen talked about today. So if that's something you'd be interested in discussing in more detail, please do get in touch with me or people watching on the live stream. You've got your respective account managers in North America as well, so we'd very much like to talk to you about that. On the subject of new business, we're all sat here as clients and prospective clients. You've all come to us via referral, which is fantastic, and thank you for your business. If you know of anybody who would benefit from the Welund service, we would absolutely love to hear from them. So do let us know if there's anyone who you think is missing out. That would be great. And lastly, these presentations, if you've hopefully enjoyed them, and we'll be in touch to get more feedback from you. And we are available to deliver these internally if you've got teams or groups who would benefit. We've already got a couple of sessions booked in with clients who weren't able to make it today. So I've left my business card on all of your seats, so do give me a shout if that would be of interest. But thank you very much indeed for coming along. And there's tea and coffee out the back for those of you here in London. For those of you on the live stream, you'll have to make that yourselves. But thank you very much indeed.